So, folks, we're on chapter 4 now, and this is where we come into some policy issues and some of the lacunas left over from neoclassical growth theory. And so, Solo pretty much established that savings and capital is what causes growth. But yeah, here a few other people, Romer and Lucas, have seen that that doesn't always bear out. So, what else is at play? And what else is at play is basically the quality of human capital, the quality of ideas, the quality of new innovation. And so that is not captured in the traditional models, but it is captured in the endogenous growth model. So, unlike the traditional growth models where there is diminishing returns to capital or to labor, you could have increasing returns in the endogenous model. And the reason is that the technology amplifies. So ideas multiply and you can't control them, they seep out. And when they seep out, other people adopt them. And when other people adopt them, that creates growth. So if you have one person invents the binary code, but they have no control about keeping it for private benefit. And so this is something that we were able to classify as private benefit versus social benefit. So the social benefit of new technologies doesn't accrue to individual firms. Otherwise, one firm who invented the technology of the binary code would be master of all things digital. But not true. The moment that got invented, people copied it, created more innovation out of it, created more programs with it, and that's what caused the digital boom. So based on the digital economy. Okay. So that being said, this gentleman Romer was proven right because his idea seems to be have some permanence to it, and so the gains from savings and capital definitely create growth, but they diminish over time. On the other hand, Romer says that this endogenous growth is more permanent because it's based on human capital and it amplifies and has spin offs. And sometimes the government steps in to protect the social benefit of these technologies because they are not just simply for one firm to capitalize on. They're pretty much for the whole economy. Now, so there's a spillover, and government has a role in that spillover. Now, there is this notion of convergence. So what that says is that, convergence basically says that economies eventually stabilize on their growth rates. So large economies will settle at like 3 or 4% growth rate, and small economies will settle at that same growth rate. But it doesn't mean that they are going to grow exactly the same amount. So some of them are going to, the larger economies, obviously their capital to labor ratio is going to dictate their income, which is going to be much higher level than the poorer economies whose capital and income ratio may be much lower, but their steady growth rates may converge. Even so, it will take a long time for a poor country to catch up to a rich country because it is not as if they are catching up to the GDP of the rich country. It's just that the growth rates level off because of the steady state notion, steady state economy. Okay. So then there's this notion of population. So populations are basically self-regulating sometimes because countries are poor because of population and because that capital is spread out amongst many more people. Now, as income grows, there is this notion that there is a higher opportunity cost of having children. and so folks procreate less, which causes birth rates to go down. So prosperous countries have low birth rates, not prosperous countries have higher birth rates, and that is keeping them in some kind of a poverty trap. So the poverty trap is low income and high population, and there doesn't seem to be any way out of it. So countries have had sterilization programs. They have other programs for contraception and things like that to limit the birth rate. But the best way to limit it is to grow the income. So what countries will do is they may kickstart. They may kickstart with a huge impetus and a huge program that says we're going to do a green revolution, agricultural revolution, or digital revolution, or smart AI revolution, and they will fund it to get past that a poverty trap that they're stuck in. Now, it so happens once you cross that phase, income starts to move and it feeds on itself. So, an amplification sets up that gets us out of that poverty trap because the government had a big push. Now, the some countries in Asia have huge growth rates, and we wonder how did China achieve this? How did Shanghai, Singapore, Taiwan, Korea, how did they achieve these growth rates? Well, the political economic solution or the answer to that is the fact that they have command economies. They can direct where this funding is going. And for example, in Korea, the private sector is very tied to the government sector. They're called chaebols, or Hyundai, and all these. These are gargantuan companies that are in cars and locomotives and infrastructure and airplanes and everything. And so, and the government sponsors them, gives them, subsidized land, subsidized tax treatment, etc., etc. So they were able to leapfrog everybody else because they had a great partner with the government. Japan, same thing, high savings rate causes plenty of accumulation of capital. The capital becomes investment, and since their population is not growing, the capital available per person was significant, and that caused their growth. So we come to case of China. China has also the same phenomena, high savings rate. And so that high savings rate, they put away a lot. And plus, a dedicated team of technocrats that run the country. They're basically not politicians, they're engineers and technical people with degrees who know how to run the economy, and they've embraced free market capitalism, and that has had to do with an explosion of benefits. So, unlike the previous system where they said, well, the government is the only sole controller of production, which didn't work because there's problems of allocation. You don't know, you can't imagine every possible variable in the economy. But if you do what they did, which is decentralize and let the market take over to some extent, where the invisible hand is working along with some visible hand, which means there is infrastructure and the government's role of keeping the market free and stable. And so if that's the only role, and you let the animal spirits of the population get unleashed, you could see what a phenomenon that's happening in China. But of course, the Chinese government also heavily subsidizes and finances industry because they don't think of themselves as a competition within the country. They think of themselves as competing with other countries. So it's China versus the United States or China versus Europe. And that's what gives them the motivation of acting as a single it used to call Japan Inc. Well, it's China Inc. So or Korea Inc. They act in concert, and that has allowed them to leapfrog Western economies into high growth Asian tigers. Now, we do see that there are some limits to growth that we've been warned of, and the limits to growth basically says, what is all this growth going to do for you? What if you run out of natural resources? Well, we're not technically going to run out of natural resources, because the solutions to running out of natural resources are also technology based. So the more resources deplete, the better the technology is to replace them. So we can either find substitutes, or we can make the same resources last longer. So the electric bulb consumed a lot of power now you can get an electric bulb that goes on forever and consumes 1 watt a week. And so technology itself is the solution to limits of growth, even though we understand that endless growth, growing forever, even though that's not really a problem, because here's where the old growth model combines with the new endogenous growth model. So neoclassical endogenous, they say that you get to a steady state of growth, and endogenous says, well, human capital kind of turns the production function and curves it upwards. So the idea of diminishing returns actually becomes increasing returns, and that could go on forever. But in reality, we know that there are limits to that, because all that technology is really dispersed widely, and it causes more competition and more people to get into the marketplace, and the competition itself acts as a limit to this endless growth. All right. Now, social infrastructure is highly important as well, because there are countries that have very loosey-goosey laws, and so you don't know who property laws. You don't know what belongs to you and what doesn't belong to you. But in countries with well-defined laws, you know exactly who owns title to this thing. So if Amazon ships a good to you, it's not yours till it hits your front door. But it's not the case in many other places. Where I say, well, we shipped it. That's it. It's yours now. And there is no recourse. So having courts and recourse and that kind of social legal structure and laws and trade laws in place, which gives you a stable environment where entrepreneurs can thrive, is also key to growth. So, when you're not having to pay bribes and graft, and people are not appropriating your property at will, and you have title to the things that you own, chances are that you're going to keep them safe, shepherd them well, and create money out of them. And so this is the notion of chapter 4 is endogenous growth. It kind of takes some of the criticisms of the neoclassical theory and says, well, what does long-term growth look like, and what is permanent growth? Well, all of that is mostly based on human capital, the how well humans are trained, and there is no limit to that. So it can create permanent growth more than simply relying on capital, which has diminishing productivities. And so social infrastructure is important. Eventually, small economies will catch up to large economies, but their growth rates may stabilize, and maybe a long time before they become actual tigers, and actually as large as the large economies. But given Solo's model of diminishing productivity, they will get into their own steady states, and their growth rates are going to equalize or stabilize. So it's not like somebody can grow on forever. And so there is this marriage between the old theory and new theory, where there are limits to the endogenous growth as well, even though the benefits of endogenous growth are more permanent. They are amplifying, knowledge amplifies, it spills over, it gets into the marketplace and creates further competition and creates revolutions. So there are phases where you have, digital revolutions, then you have AI revolution, and each one of them is basically an amplification that is creating more and more growth. So that's our chapter 4, and I will continue with chapter 5 next.